are on that were at our last webinar. So thank you for once again joining our Brave Space. So I want to go ahead and dive in pretty quickly and let's introduce our participants. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Sudie Whalen. I'm the Deputy Director of CalPro and the co-author of CalPro's Successful Learners Through Equity module. This is the third webinar in our series. The first webinar, Let's Talk Bridging Equitable Gaps and Creating Safe Spaces, is available on our website right now. If you would like to access this webinar, you can do so through our video library on CalPro's website, and you can also access it via the link in the slide deck PDF that Vicki will send to all webinar registrants. We will be having our teacher panel today, and then we're also working on a research brief on equity in adult education, connecting research to practice, and we'll have a webinar with the panelists and co-authors and contributors of that research brief in May to wrap up our series. So let's dive in so we can get to the fantastic people we have with us today to talk about the work that they're doing as change agents at their sites. Francisco Narciso is an equity advocate. As an integrated education and training teacher advisor, he supports English language learners across career classes and to help them to persist to their career goals. As a PhD candidate, his research advances equity for at-risk students in online learning. He's been with LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, that is, adult education since 1998. His passion and mission is to further equity in education. Next, we have Marcy England. Over the past 14 years, Marcy England has worked as an ESL program, an ESL program as instructor and ESL program coordinator. Additionally, she serves as integrated education and training, IET, coordinator and technology team lead. She's facilitated several communities of practice for CalPro, ranging from accelerated learning to English language proficiency standards, and also our Successful Learners Through Equity module. Marcy has a master's in science degree from Cal State University Fullerton, where her research focused on just, equitable, and inclusive education for adult learners. Marcy believes that equity matters because each person has value, experience, and importance, but each person does not have the same starting point, access, treatment, or even opportunity. Equity is what's given to each person. Equity is giving each person the support that they need. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Karen Crow-Ruiz joined the world of adult education in 2005 and has taught in most academic programs, concurrent high school, ESL, ABE, GED, and high school diploma, both in person and independent study. In addition to the role of WASC coordinator and data analyst, she is currently the senior academic specialist, and she is currently a senior academic specialist for a curriculum development company and an ABE, GED evening instructor at Visalia Adult School in the Central Valley of California. Before we get into our 4 tenets of engagement that we talked about last time, I do want to do one more quick introduction. On with us today also is Ms. Anna Ariely, who's CalPro's new regional training coordinator, and she will be also overseeing a lot of our webinars, so she is joining us today as well. Anna, would you like to say a quick hello?
Sure. Thank you, Sudie. Yes, I'm so excited to step into this new position as the CalPro Regional Training Coordinator. I have over 15 years of education, the last 5 of which have been in adult basic education. And I'm so excited to be part of this amazing project and to get to know all of you and to work together to help our students.
Thank you so much, Anna. We are happy to have you as part of our CalPro family. Alrighty, so before we dive in, we want to our questions for our panelists today. I want to remind us of the 4 tenets that we talked about in our last webinar, where we talked about creating a brave space and for us all to be willing to be brave in this space. And part of those 4 tenets is to stay engaged today and to stay engaged in this work as we move forward. Expect a little bit of discomfort. You may hear as we go through this conversation something that maybe is unusual to you, you haven't heard before, or maybe even something that you're like, oh, I might have done that. That's okay. These are growing pains and these are growing spaces, and discomfort can happen. This is also a conversational space. As we're going through our questions, if you have answers to the questions we're asking, and if you want to jump into the conversation, please feel free to do so. You can join us in the chat, raise your hand and unmute. We want this to be a conversation, discussional space, just like we had in November, but we want you to be able to speak your truth. So remember, this is a brave space. Please note, just like with the November webinar, if anything is stated that you feel uncomfortable with or that we feel might come back later that you may not want to share with others, we will edit that out. We are all about making sure this is a brave space and making sure that no one is penalized for speaking their truth. Last and certainly not least, expect and accept non-closure. Equity is an ongoing process. It's not a one and done. It's something we regularly have to do. And you're not going to necessarily have closure on the whole equity conversation today. And that's okay. Remember, this is an ongoing process and we continue to work towards equity for all of our students. With that being said, let's go ahead and move into our first question. Ready, panelists?
Yeah.
Ready.
So I'm going to go to you first, Marcy. What does racial equity look like at your agency?
Well, first, like you just stated, it's important to understand that racial equity is a process and a journey. You can absolutely set goals and achieve them, but then you're constantly looking back to grow and get better and better. And it's just really a cycle. So for us, racial equity looks like classroom conversations and activities that are inclusive, print media and photographs that reflect our student population, data-driven answers instead of assumptions, revisit of our mission and our vision, and a safe space where decisions and practices can be reviewed and questioned.
Thank you so much for that, Marcy. I think you're exactly right. And I love that you mentioned that inclusivity and that intentional inclusiveness. Francisco, what about you? What does racial equity look like for you at your agency?
Thanks, Judy, for that question. So for LA Unified Adult Education, racial equity looks like students getting access to resources, but not only access to resources, but us helping them remove barriers so everyone succeeds. So for example, every student, regardless of race, regardless of program, gets an individual student plan. And this plan is for each student, and it helps them identify and develop a pathway, an educational and career pathway to achieve their goals. And an example of removing barriers is through our IET program, Integrated Education and Training, where English learners can enter a CTE pathway by taking career classes even before they complete an ESL program. So it's a fast track to career classes. Racial equity also is evident in examples such as celebrations and our division website. We celebrate ESL, academic, and CT graduations, acknowledging all successes for all students. And so this gives an example for everyone, regardless of race, of what success could look like for them. And in addition, we have our division website, which mirrors this, right? We put on our division website different representations of success of different students from different populations in our community.
Thank you so much, Francisco. I think some part of what you just said is really important, that recognizing success for all students. And part of this equity conversation is being sure that we're not lowering standards for students just so we can look like we're bridging the equity gap, but holding all students to the same high standards or to equitable high standards. So the most that they themselves can achieve and pushing them towards that. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. I want to turn now to Karen. Karen, when you think about this conversation, what are some successes for racial equity that you've experienced in adult education?
So, we can all point to specific events that we have on our campuses. I know that at my campus, and it was actually not only pre-COVID, but even pre-swine flu, we had, multicultural day where we would have everybody come to school dressed in clothes from their tradition or from their culture in their countries, and they would share food. That was pre-swine flu. And so they would bring food and we would share, across the campus. It wasn't just in ESL. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to kind of think about is that, accepting cultures and traditions is something that needs to occur outside of our ESL classes. It needs to occur in all of our classes, regardless of what that class is. And so it's easy to point fingers and say, well, we had a multicultural day. That's really great. But Francisco was saying, it needs to be something that's intentional, that happens in all classes all the times. And, we really if we look at the past 2 years and on my campus, thinking about our students having equal and equitable access to their classes, to resources, opening up classes, changing times, changing how those classes are available to our students. That's being mindful of all of their needs, listening to them as we go, making sure that those needs are being met.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think that's really important. And I think one of the pieces you just said about it's not just about having those cultural days, but going beyond that is so important. Marcy, same question. What are some successes for racial equity you've experienced in adult education?
Sure. So in the past, we used to take a look at our largest demographic and kind of use that as a target group. For teachers in a multi-level classroom, it's a lot like teaching to the middle, and just everyone else kind of falls by the wayside. Now we have access, and maybe we had it, but we are actively going to access community demographic data and making sure that it's matched with our school demographic data and ensure that we're really meeting the needs of the students in our community, in our area. Another success I've seen in our adult education's focus on racial equity is the change in communication. So at our school, we completed the Success for All Learners Through Equity training, and that work that we did brought our entire team to this common ground. Like the conversations we had, the expectations we shared, and the goals that we had for our students were all common. And it gave us a set of language that we could use to describe discrepancies or problems that we saw. And it also gave us that voice to say, hey, I'm noticing something, because we were all on the same page together by going to that training together. It also gave us this, we feel safe to look at things and to question maybe policies or procedures and the value that and the impact they have on equity, and look at old systems and see if perhaps they're creating barriers for our system. Now we know the importance of dismantling them.
Yes, I love that, being an active barrier buster. Thank you so much, Marcy.
Yeah.
Francisco, what are same question for you, some of the successes with racial equity at your campus?
Well, just in general, if we look at the demographics of students in, for example, a four-year public school or two-year public school compared to adult education school, the demographics are a lot different. And so through our adult ed programs, we're really addressing the needs of a different population than what we see in a four-year public or two-year public college.
Great. I'm going to stick with you for just a moment, Francisco, to the piggyback question on this, not just successes in adult education, but have you experienced specific success at your agency particularly?
Yes, thanks for that question again, Sudhi. So the recent events have focused our attention to the need for equity and steps to eliminate racism and other biases in our society. Our district, LA Unified Adult, was part of an equity COP through a collaboration with LARIC, the LA Regional Adult Education Consortium, and CalPro. And this was a three-part approach with the goal to support adult education staff and teachers to increase the cultural competence and create, a more equitable environment for them and for students. LA Unified Adult Education participated in the LARIC board training, and then the second part of it was a core group of faculty that were trained, and then finally it ended with a trainer of trainers. And so just the idea was to create more equitable environments. Topics that we talked about were, for example, implicit bias, similarities and differences in culture and cultural competency, and microaggressions, and bridging the gap between peoples.
Great. And Francisco, I also want to circle kind of back to some of the things that you all are doing at LAUSD, because I think you all established some really cool partnerships and things like that that also created more access for some of your students. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so we partner with an organization called HTA, Hospitality Training Academy. And this is a high road to employment partnership where we've created an 18-day course for students who are English learners to get a fast track to get serve safe, knife skills, customer service, and other skills to get them jobs quickly in the hospitality and grocery industry. We've also partnered with the mayor's office, Mayor Garcetti, and our district. We're trying to close the gap on the early childhood education gap. And through our programs, we have child development classes where students can become teachers or assistants. And so with the partnership with the mayor's office, we're trying to create more opportunities to get our students teaching, but in turn, get people in the community more access to early childhood education.
Yeah, that gives them access to early childhood education and additional access to employment as well. Very cool. And I think one of the things you just talked about in terms of, the integrated education training programs and the connection to employment and things like that really gets to kind of the heart of what the WIOA Title II legislation gets to, which is that helping students earn a life-sustaining wage, right? And trying to bridge that equity gap in terms of who has access to workforce and to careers and things like that. And so, if you're not already doing an IET program, maybe think about how you can and how you can fold those things in. Let's get to our next question. I'm going to turn over to you, Marcy, because I have a question for you. I want to first explain the concept of peeling back the wallpaper, so this question makes sense to those who are not familiar with the training with CalPro. So when we talk about peeling back the wallpaper, when we use that that analogy, what we're talking about is imagining this wallpaper that's okay, but maybe it needs a little work, could be kind of dated, but when you pull it back, there's just layers and layers of ugly wallpaper. Could be mildew or mold on the wall, could be busted up walls. It's just not pretty back there. And when we utilize that analogy, what we're talking about is going beyond the surface level of what we think about our students and the data that we submit, and really digging into where are the equity gaps, what are the equity gaps, and sometimes that means shining a bright light on something ugly so we can fix it. So when we think about that, how has peeling back the wallpaper, Marcy, for you, or digging deeper at your school, really increased equity at your agency?
Sure, I'd like to just really give an example. So I was recently in a leadership meeting, not too far in the recent past, and we were discussing the problem of high school diploma students not persisting. And in the meeting, the conversation began to move towards general statements like those students need blank, or the students aren't coming because of blank. And immediately my history and training from facilitating this COP, this topic so often, my radar went up, and I was like, we need to dig a little deeper here. These are sounding like assumptions. And fortunately, our leadership team is this safe space where I was able to just say that statement, like, hey, you know what? These sound like assumptions. I think we need to dig a little deeper. And so as a team, we decided to peel back the wallpaper. So what we did is we divided up different tasks that would help us determine the true root of the problem. We had one team member put together a script survey to interview each student for their personal insight on what's happening with them personally. We had another team member was our data person, and his job was to run reports on student demographics, including workforce, age, what type of class format they were taking. Now, although this took more time than quick fixes, like usually your gut just says, okay, well, let's offer more. Maybe they're not coming because of this, so let's change our schedule, or let's quickly do this, which is kind of like breaking an old habit. So instead of doing that, we were able to receive feedback from the students and then adjust based on that feedback. We increased communication between teacher and students based on some of our findings, and we were also able to determine that over 55% of our students are now online. They're working, and so they weren't being supported the way they needed to be supported. So all of these issues and barriers would not have been uncovered if we would have just stuck with those blanket statements that we were using in the beginning. So our next steps are now to look at the demographic population data in Corona versus our enrollment to ensure that we're really reaching out to those that are underserved. So that's just an example of when peeling back the wallpaper really stops you. It helps you from making assumptions and decisions that will then lead to just more barriers.
Thank you so much for sharing that truth, Marcy. And I think it's really easy for us to make assumptions based on what we know. We say, I know my students, I know this population and things like that, and make programmatic decisions based on those assumptions. And I think it takes a little bit of bravery to say, hey, we're making some assumptions. We need to, pull back the wallpaper, look at the data a little bit closer. And so thank you for doing that advocacy. And I hope that others who are on this call also have that level of empowerment to say when you feel like you're making assumptions or you feel like you need to speak up so that you can dig a little bit deeper. Thank you, Marcy. Francisco, you all had an interesting approach to peeling back the wallpaper in response to the pandemic. Do you want to share a little bit about that? And then we'll get to Ed's question next.
Yeah, and when the pandemic first hit us, we made some assumptions that going online was the answer for everyone. And what we found out as we peeled back the wallpaper, it wasn't the answer for everyone. And there are some students that were left out. And so we responded by creating a low-tech entry point for students through distance learning. Students were able to continue learning English using videos and using paper workbook. And this low-tech approach gave people an entry point to continue studying English, but also the goal was to build their capacity so that they can, in the future, learn through technology.
So while you were doing that, you're kind of simultaneously beefing up their digital literacy skills so that they could be more successful. Brilliant. I love that. Ed asked in the chat, Francisco, and I'm not sure if you're able to, if you have the demographic data to respond to this, knowing your research brain, you might. He said, what were the demographic differences that you saw on your campus compared to Cal State University or the California Community Colleges system?
So yeah, what I was looking at is through data from the National Center of Education Statistics. And what they showed was that for four-year public institutions, just a breakdown of different ethnicities. And the majority in a four-year public was 55%. For example, the majority was 55% white. For a two-year public institution, the majority was 47% white, as opposed to, in general, adult education in California, where our stats are, excuse me while the majority is a lot different than what we see in the four-year or two-year institution. The majority is Hispanic. And my point was that there's a difference in the demographics. And so we're addressing different needs depending on their agencies.
Thank you. And I had a feeling you would have that data on hand. Did you have any other question, Ed, that you wanted to add or follow up?
Thank you. Gender, did you find that, as we do, that heavy female on the adult school campuses? Heavy, I'm sorry. An abundance of females.
I think we understood.
Got a city?
Hi, Ed.
I'm going to keep digging my hole, so I'm muting.
Yeah, but so Francisco, did you notice that the gender demographics were similar in California as they were to the other systems?
So what I noticed was the adult ed demographics, and you're right, Ed, that the demographics are more leaning, not heavy, leaning towards female, but I'm not sure what the demographics, I don't have the research for the four-year or two-year public institutions in regards to female or male demographics. But you're right, a majority of them are female in adult ed.
And anybody can access the NCES data tables. So feel free to look into those and check those out and do some exploratory work if you're interested in learning more about us compare in adult education compared to other demographic groups. So I'm going to get us to our next question, and I'm going to stick with Francisco again for just a moment. How do you, Francisco, ensure that all students receive an equitable second chance? Because we know adult education is often a second chance for many of our students, whether they're coming from needing to retrain for work, or if they're coming from just not having the basic job skills that they need, or even reentry and returning citizens. How does LAUSD ensure that they're being equitable with those second chances?
Thanks, Sudhi. So making resources accessible for all can support equitable second chances. Second chance opportunities are integral for many groups, and especially groups that might be at risk caused by some barriers. And such groups are returning citizens, homeless, and new Americans. And these groups are assisted with second chance opportunities through what we have in our district as navigators. And these navigators are jobs, people that are co-located in our schools and co-located at the WorkSource Center, and they provide co-case management services for for these groups that need second chances to advance their career. Now, recently, I'm very happy to say we had a student that completed their MC3, a pre-apprenticeship training program. He was previously incarcerated and then re-entered into community. He came to us and received a 12-week course of soft skill training, technical education, and support services. And this success was through a partnership with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition and the LA Orange County Building Trades Council. And then I have one more quick story. A student who was, another student who was released from prison after 26 years, and she attended one of our adult schools and received computer essential skills classes, and it helped her get a job as a client aide. And this transition to her new job was easier for her because she had help from a new way of life and LA Unified Adult Education. This was a partnership between the two organizations. And another outcome is that she enrolled in community college to complete her AA degree in business.
That's awesome. I want to pause here and turn this question to some of our participants too, because I think all of us are actively trying to give our students an equitable second chance. And so I'm curious how some of our non-panelists are doing these things. So anyone who's comfortable with sharing, how do you try to ensure equitable second chances at your campus? Go ahead, Ed.
I'll go, Sudie. By providing them extra support, by building, making sure we have these strong partnerships in our community that provide that extra support outside of the classroom. I think interesting, we have a road here that's outside the school that goes down to our alternative education, community day school, and we call it Second Chance Road. And it's kind of a neat little educational services, alternative education, team that provides second, third, fourth chances. But I think it comes down to support, and I'm just thinking of roots and rebound that help our former felons get through adult education. So I think I'm just thinking of support that you go above and beyond and hook our students up with resources outside that can take care of transportation and food and clothing and fees, and so they can get their education here.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad you answered that way, because that leads us into our next question, because thinking about those services and supports and resources and all of those things, and having that on Second Chance Road is kind of cool, Ed. So let's go to our next question. I'm going to turn us to Karen, who we haven't heard from in a little bit. Karen, how do you provide, or how can we provide all of our students with the resources that they specifically need to succeed within the classroom?
So, my experience comes from a classroom teacher point of view. So as classroom teachers, we don't have a whole lot of power to start new programs or bring a lot of resources in and plan for things like that. We can do some of that, and we do try to bring in some sources, but a lot of that is done kind of district or admin level. So just as a classroom teacher, what I'm doing is reaching out to the students, letting them know, hey, I've talked to this web organization, that web organization, and I've talked to Proteus, I've talked with Employment Connection, they have this opportunity, they have this job fair, they have these different things that are available for, as different resources. We had on our campus the last 2 years, we had somebody from an organization called Employment Connection on campus with us. So anytime our students needed help with housing issues, with their bills, with their phones, if they needed mental health issues, or had mental health issues and needed some assistance, if they needed childcare things, if they needed assistance paying for tests, looking for jobs, stuff like that, we could put them in connection with them and they could help out. And so really, those of us that are teachers and boots on the ground in the classes working directly with the students, just continually having that dialogue and becoming a resource for them really helps. So that even now I have students who are in my special former students class on my Remind. And so they still will reach out to me, even though they're no longer my students, and say, hey, we had something happen and we lost our job. So what was that organization you were talking about in school last year that would help us with our housing or help us pay our electric bill? Okay, do you still have that number or that contact information? So just making that accessible, you know, to everyone. And then obviously, like, to piggyback on what Marcy was saying and what Narciso was saying, the next step would be for our site to really look at the data and the graphics and the information to determine, like, you know, what organizations or what things are our students reaching out to the most, and is there a way for them to then bring them onto campus more often and to have them, you know, maybe interact with our students on a more regular basis or have them do presentations, so that information not only gets out to our students but out to our community as well, because our students will share that with their friends and family.
Thank you so much, Karen. And what you just mentioned reminds me of that peeling back the wallpaper handout from the training, where the questions are, who is utilizing this service? Who has access? Why or why not? You do have a question in the chat, Karen. Elizabeth asked if you could please repeat the name of the resources you use to keep in touch with former students.
Oh, so I use the Remind texting app, which isn't really, I don't have to use it as a texting app. I actually don't have the app on my phone. I just have the students text back and forth with me, but you as a teacher can also use it on your computer. And it's just a way that you can text back and forth with your students. And you can either send a single text back or whole group text back, and nobody's phone number gets shared. So there's a little bit of that privacy tool in there for you.
Thank you, Karen. So I want to go ahead and shift us over to a similar vein, but sticking with you for just a moment, Karen. How are students' personal and social circumstances integrated into, you know, achieving academic success? How do you see how those things sort of overlap their ability to be physically present, but also emotionally, mentally present, or to have, you know, just the busting down of those barriers, like Marcy was mentioning the different barriers earlier? How do those personal and social circumstances interact with their school experience?
I think, you know, the personal and social are like the, you know, huge barriers sometimes for our students. And, you know, the group of students I have now, I've been texting with them all morning in regards to some of the barriers that they're facing. You know, I would love to be able to finish my GED, but, you know, we don't have enough workers at the restaurant, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do work for the next couple of weeks. You know, what does that make it look like for my class? Are you going to drop me because I might not be able to do the required hours? Things like that, things that go on in their personal lives outside of work and outside of classwork as well. And so, you know, to go back on the Remind thing, just to be able to have a dialogue with our students. And I would say that, you know, if the pandemic didn't teach us anything, it certainly taught us how to reach out to our students in a variety of different ways. And so, you know, if emails don't work, try Remind Text. If Remind Text doesn't work, try phone calls. If phone calls don't work, maybe Zooms. Anything to have that one-on-one dialogue with students. And I will tell you this too, as a part-time teacher, I'm also working with a couple of concurrent high school students. And I have a student who, you know, I knew was like kind of flailing and kind of started when this semester with me and had done like 4 hours one week and then 2 hours another week. And then said, well, there's a big football game and I don't know if I can do any time this week. And maybe I can do some, I don't know when. And I said, well, how about Sunday? Because Sunday, you don't have anything. Let's try Sunday. She did 2 hours Sunday. I just sent off a text to her and said, hey, I saw that she did 2 hours of work on Sunday. That's awesome. Let's see if you can do another 2 hours sometime this week. She sent me a text this morning. She's like, my teachers have never texted me and said I did a good job. They're usually telling me I have to do something instead of you did great. So those little pieces just really, really help our students, you know, boost their persistence and stay active. And I think it's really about building those relationships with each one of your students. And then you get to learn more about what's going on in their lives and having those conversations, and then building that empathy for their situation based on that situation. And also, you know, suggesting some other options. My student who's working in the restaurant, she's like, when can I be done with my GED? Well, let's start with daily check-ins and we'll see how much you did the day before. And she said that would really help her. So things like that, working with them where they are with what they need.
Thank you, Karen. One of the things we talked about previously when we were just talking in conversation prepping for this session was, you know, how trauma and having that personal trauma experience can impact your academic success, and how sometimes students not showing up is a trauma response. Do you want to speak a little bit to that too?
Yeah, so I have had students who've had major issues in the last couple of years. It seems the stress of the pandemic has built on the stress that was already bubbling under the surface in their own lives. So I've had students whose partners have been deported or jailed, or they've had trauma issues within their homes. I've had young students who've had trauma issues with parents in their homes because their parents are have lost work and then are at home and upset and angry because of that stress of losing work. And so to be able to check in this with a student and just to do, I do sometimes just, I call them mental health checks. The students don't know that's what they are, but just like a, hey, how you're doing? How are you doing? It has zero to do with what's going on with school, but just, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help? And a lot of times if we can find some help, then they are able to come back to us in the classroom and in a work situation.
Thank you, Karen. I think it's also important to think about when we're thinking about racial equity and trauma, and I'm so glad that that's something that you're intentionally focusing on, that we have to also remember that 2020, the summer of 2020, wasn't that long ago. And we have students who went through a lot during that time. And there's a lot of intersectionality across various demographic communities that were impacted. And so the feeling of safety when coming into a classroom and feeling accepted and included is really important. And we have to remember that sometimes the not feeling safe and not feeling welcome immediately has nothing to do with how the student was marketed the course or the training or the program, but might be a trauma-informed response. And so we want to make sure that we're being inclusive, we're being equitable, that we're embracing diversity and demonstrating that on our campuses and our marketing materials, so that students, from the moment they hear about us, they know this is a safe place. This is not a place where you should expect to experience a bunch of microaggressions. This is where we want you included, we want you involved, and things like that. Because, I know how the world has moved on, the media has moved on, but our students who are in the thick of that, especially in some of our Central and Southern California, even Bay Area areas, they experienced that trauma in real time in 2020, and that wasn't even 2 years ago. So we want to, kind of remember that when we're thinking about racial equity and being inclusive, that we want to be sensitive to those traumas and be intentionally inclusive so students are feeling welcome. I'm going to get off my soapbox for a moment and turn to Marcy, because we also had a really interesting conversation about this topic. And I want to hear your thoughts about how students' personal and social circumstances kind of integrate with their success within their academic success.
Sure. And just to piggyback on what you were talking about, I think one of the key things in the classroom, developing the safe space, is that the teacher is modeling that behavior. And so it's really important that administrators are making sure that the entire staff understands, like, we're all on this page. These are our goals. We are all striving that this is a safe space, and you're working in your PLC community, you're working in your staff meetings to develop what that looks like, because Karen did such a good job articulating and giving us a glimpse into what a teacher does and the role of the teacher and how the teacher really sets the standard in the classroom. And so when a teacher does see like a microaggression or something happening in the classroom, the teacher needs to feel empowered to say, hey, and how to handle that. We respect this person's culture and diversity, and I want to hear more about this. And our students are looking to us for a definition of how to behave and how to experience each other's differences. So I think that's really, really key. As far as the personal and social circumstances and how they relate to academic achievement, Karen made a statement, and she said, I'm just a classroom teacher. And I just think, like, the classroom teachers and the front office staff, that's where it's at, right there. And so we really quickly recognized at our school, like, hey, all of these students are coming back onto campus, and they're all turning to their teachers, and they all have a little bit of something more than they used. Like, they're all carrying, and our teachers, everyone's carrying a little more in their backpack right now than we used to. And so as a leadership team at our school, we thought, how can we support these teachers? Teachers are counselors, staff members are counselors, like we all are doing this work. So how can we really, from a leadership standpoint or perspective, how can we support these teachers? We know they're doing it. They're like, what Karen's doing is like the gold standard, but teachers are doing this on all different levels. And so how can we support them? So we created a resource, nothing fancy, but a Padlet where resources were organized by topic, where everyone could turn. We can turn students there. It's on our website. We also have like a staff version. So immediately giving the tools so that we can support those personal and social circumstances. Instead of, if someone comes to me and says, hey, you know, teacher, I don't have food for my family, I would be normally like, okay, let me Google search that. And that, no, I can turn to our school resource page. We have one teacher that just is so dedicated. She keeps updating that. And it's really kind of low tech, but it's working really well for our students and our staff, and help. So when students are fed and their needs are met, they have all these different needs, they can succeed more in the classroom. So we want to help our teachers help our students.
Thank you, Marcy. And Lori in the chat asked if you'd be willing to share the link to the resources so they can see a good model of that.
Yes. And remember, I said it's like pretty low tech, like it's nothing super fancy. And I think that that's important. Sometimes we think like, oh, well, it's got to be developed on the website. No, we just pick a Padlet, throw it. So sure, I'll put it in the link. Absolutely. Or in the chat.
Thank you, Marcy. All right, I'm going to move us on to our next question. If there aren't any other questions or comments, I'm going to turn to you first, I think, Francisco. How is student identity integrated in your classroom or in the classrooms that you manage?
So first of all, let's talk about student identity. And student identity is a complex topic. Students are not just a certain race or not just a certain sex. And Ed alluded to that earlier when he asked more questions about who are the students. You know, our students are an intersection of many different identities. And so the more we understand our students, the more, and their different layers of identity, the more we can understand what they need. And so through LA Unified Adult Education, we encourage our students to address student identity. And we talk about these layered identities for each student. And we tried to support this idea of student identity in curriculum and instruction through what's called the Teaching and Learning Framework. And this is a framework we use for LAUSD. And we push this framework and we support teachers through our community practices. Each of our programs, we have a community practice every month, and our community practices are focused on this teaching and learning framework as it relates to student identity. And we have PDs that support this teaching and learning framework. And in fact, our teacher evaluations are based on this teaching and learning framework. And so there's real importance to student identity. So for example, why are some discussions more engaging for students, right? Why are some projects or activities or assignments why are students having more fun with these activities? Well, it has to do with identity, right? When we can create discussion topics and discussion activities that are differentiated, that align with our students and their identities, right? They're complex, multi-layered identities, then they can begin to participate in these discussions in more meaningful ways. When we create projects and assignments that align with these layered student identities, then some of these projects can be applied to the real world, can be relevant, and students can start constructing their own understanding of the material based on the identity and the teacher inserting identity into planning when they create these activities. And then finally, the feedback that we give students, right? Growing up, I've gotten the feedback, hey, great job or good work. That, for me, it has nothing to do with, well, first of all, it has nothing to do with the goals of the the goals of the activity, but also doesn't take into consideration student identity. And so when we know a student has a certain goal maybe we could tweak our feedback to support that goal. And so again, this teaching and learning framework really encompasses the student in the center and how we could address students.
Thank you, Francisco. And Vicky posted the link to the teaching and learning framework into the chat in case you're interested in knowing what that resource is he's talking about and how to understand more student identity and layer that into your instruction intentionally. Karen, same question to you. How is identity integrated into your class?
So, we kind of work with our students in both of the programs that I'm doing, since I don't get to see them that very often. They're only with me a couple of days a week. And, I don't actually work face-to-face with them a lot because most of them are working from home. So I really try to encourage them to, share with me and let me know like what's working for you. I let them have a voice, like which way is going to work best with you in regards to how you work or how I address you or how we deal with things, and so, I just want them to feel like, they have a say at what's going on in the classroom, that the way they work, is important to them, then it's going to be important to me. Their needs that are important to them, their identities that are important to them, they're also important to me. When we do have students who are in class and working together, we really do try to include all of the students in any sort of conversation that I'm having. So even if I have students, and I do have a couple that come in, every week on Tuesday and Thursday to work with me because they would prefer to work in class, when I get a new student who comes in, I will try to include them in the conversation as I'm introducing the student to the work. Oh, this is a student who's been here for a while. How can, do you have anything to add to the conversation? Did I leave anything out in our introduction? So they kind of get used to being able to have conversations and know that this is an open and safe place, so that then they can kind of start opening up, and then I can start making those connections as well. Like, oh, so-and-so works at Denny's. Didn't you just work at Denny's before? You did. Are you doing the day shift? Are you doing the night? So just trying to build those connections and trying to help them then kind of feel like, okay, we understand each other. We have something in common. We can have some dialogue. We can dialogue about other things. And I've then seen that grow into things where they're dialoguing about resources outside. Did you know about the diaper? There's a place in Tulare that has supplies for young mothers. And so they're kind of sharing. So, they're sharing, and like you guys said before, like different groups. It's not just, man or woman or a racial identity or what have you. It could be, I'm a working mom, I'm a stay-at-home mom, I'm a young mom, my kids are all grown. The ones I love to pair together the most are the students who are, working on their GEDs, but kind of retired and in that kind of golden age bracket, with the students that are like, oh, I just don't even know what to do. Like my car, I lost a tire. I had a student whose license plates kept getting taken off of the back of her car. And I had another student who actually worked in the DMV. She's like, well, let me tell you who to work with. And so those kind of additional identities that we don't necessarily think about, that we can kind of pair together and work into our classroom community.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really like how you're trying to be intentional with the nuances of pairing students who may not otherwise be paired together and may not otherwise work together and things like that. And, that really does help model that embracing of diversity within the classroom amongst the students themselves. Because when we think about equity and diversity and inclusion and all of those things, it's not just about making sure staff is doing the right thing, but it's also making sure that students are learning the right thing as well. So Lori added in the chat, she really appreciates, Karen, hearing about how you interact with your students and how you consistently reach out to them with their education and their lives. So I do want to turn to Marcy, because she also had kind of an interesting perspective about integrating identity into the classroom. Go ahead, Marcy.
Sure. I just wanted, as you can tell from what my colleagues have shared, celebrating culture isn't limited to the ESL classroom. Like their culture really is, students' culture really is their identity, and it's part of who they are. And we want to be really careful to preserve that in our classrooms. And I think before I went through, like, could I call it like an equity awakening? Like when I really started recognizing a few years ago, like, hey, looking at myself and determining, like, what am I doing? What are my practices and how am I facilitating things in my classroom, and really diving deep into equity and seeing how I could be more of an advocate and how I could do better. That's when I realized this is so small, but that, like, differences are the coolest part about our classrooms. And like, really just, I would have never, a few years ago, I don't think I would have said, okay, we're going to find our similarities and we're going to celebrate our differences. Like, let's figure out, like, how are we all different and what makes us unique? And it's those little, it's a small mindset shift, but I really think that as we let our students share what makes them different and what part of their culture they bring to the classroom, and that's when we really are, we're really solidifying their identity and showing that we respect, like, who they are and everything that they're bringing with them to the classroom. I just think such a small mindset shift is really important, though, because it's those little micro changes that make a big difference.
Exactly. I really like that you said that, because when we think about this topic, we often think about how a small microaggression can make a big difference in how a student perceives their education experience. But you're also right about how those small micro positive changes can make a huge difference in how a student experiences their education at their program. And so it can go both ways. And so when we're really intentional with being inclusive of culture, embracing culture, and celebrating those differences that create the tapestry that we talk about, that is the United States of America, especially here in California, you know, that piece of being intentional with that small mindset shift, but also those small little nuances and those small little things that you do to make sure students are seen, that they are included, and that their identity is affirmed, that we're never telling them that you're othered and you're not welcome here, but you're awesome because you're you, period, regardless to what that you is. Or, you know, how I have a friend who has a t-shirt that says, I'm not colorblind. I see all colors and all colors are beautiful. Like those kinds of things, and celebrating that. Kira, I did just see you unmute. Did you want to share? And she's like, that was an accident. All right, well, we're going to continue the conversation to our next question. I'm going to stick with you for a second, Marcy, because I know you've done some intentional work in this area. What are some examples of culturally responsive policies and practices that you can point to and things like that?
Yeah, so sometimes policies or practices in our schools are not culturally responsive. And these policies could have come, they're not coming from a bad place. They're not coming from intentionally being not culturally responsive. Maybe they just made sense at the time, but they weren't looked at through the lens of equity. And so, and some of it is like tradition and history and just stuff that we do because, I don't know, we do because we do it. And we've done it and they did it and it just continues. And so an example of this was at our school, we had a policy of taking certain forms of payment from different programs, students in different programs. So for example, we would take accept checks from CTE students, but ESL students were only allowed to pay cash for their textbooks. So fortunately, we no longer have that policy, but looking back, you can recognize that that policy really is not culturally responsive. And when our policies and procedures exclude certain groups of people, that's a red flag that we need to take a deeper look at why we have that policy and where it might need to be changed or adjusted. And I just again want to note that almost always these policies are not intended. The intention was never to be culturally unresponsive. They just need to be, policies really need to be revisited regularly through this mindset of equitable access. Like, hey, what do you think about this? I'm feeling, and again, I think this really again comes back to that safe space. Like if everyone at your school or your institution feels comfortable to say, hey, you know, I noticed we do this and I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about it. Can we look at it and make sure that this policy is equitable and culturally responsive, and know that you're safe even bringing it up at your school, and that it won't be like, oh, here now we have to redo this policy. No, that's not the case. We want to make sure we're looking at those. So that's an example of how we've chosen to do better at our school.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that example. And I think there's two thoughts I'm having about what you're talking about. One is that idea of having that safe space to speak. And I think the other piece of that is, if you're not sure if you have a safe space, can you make it a brave space? Can you stand in your own truth and say, I don't think this is a culturally responsive policy, and can we move that forward? Is that something that you feel that you can do? I'm not saying this is something you have to do. I'm saying to think about if that's something you can do. To the point about the policy changes, yeah, I think you're exactly right. These are things that are often legacy policies. Like, you know, we established this one program and this one payment method, and we created this other program with this other payment method. Then we realized they weren't the same. And we left it that way, though, because that's the way we always did it. So, and then taking a moment to look at it through the equity lens and say, but why did we keep that the same? Why haven't we changed that, right? I think a really common place that happens a lot is in attendance policies. We have this, what I call the student choice myth. If our students really cared about their education, they would choose to show up for class, right? But for some students, it's not really a choice. If the choice is, do I go to class or lose my job? If the choice is, do I go to class or take care of my children? If the choice is, do I go to class or put food on the table? The option is clearly not really a choice. It's, I have to go to work. I have to take care of my family. I have to take care of these things. That goes back to that personal and social situations that impact education. And so if you're really looking to begin peeling back the wallpaper, I encourage you to start with your attendance policies and think about, are those policies actually equitable? I can say from my own experience that I thankfully was able to be in a brave and safe space and say my truth in those moments, but I felt like our attendance policy was penalizing working students. We were trying to get them to earn a sustainable wage, but they were penalizing them for going to work because they missed too much class, right? Luckily, I had an administrator who was super supportive and was willing to work with me in the district to revise that policy so that students could submit activities online, assignments online. As long as you got everything turned in that week, we're not going to penalize you because you had to go to work. There are some lab exercises, because for those who don't know, I was CTE, that you did need to be present for. That doesn't mean we couldn't make other times up and things like that. So we adjusted when we offered lab hours. So it wasn't just in the morning, it could also be in the afternoon. So students needed to do an activity that they weren't there for class and they couldn't make it to morning lab. Well, there's a third alternative, which is evening lab. If it was something that they didn't actually have to be in the classroom to submit, we allowed them to submit that online. What we saw happen, though, was greater persistence. Students stuck with the programs and they're more likely to finish because they weren't being penalized for going to work. And then we also saw that there was a lot more completion, there was much more satisfaction. And then we also started to see students really wanting to be on campus more frequently when they could be, as opposed to feeling like, oh, I'm gonna get fussed at because I missed class last week, so I shouldn't even bother coming. So it just had a positive impact on our program in general. So, you know, my point is to say, when you're thinking about peeling back the wallpaper, looking at those policies, if you're just trying to find a place to start, look at your attendance policies and find out if students are being penalized for having to deal with real life. So I'm going to get off that soapbox again. It's my second soapbox of the day. And move us to our next question. And I want to lead with you, Karen, here, because I know that you've experienced this in your real life, in your personal life. And so I want to start with you here. How are linguistic differences valued and appreciated, and why does this matter?
So yeah, this is kind of a personal question for me, just because I've had, you know, experiences with, you know, linguistics issues, and both personal and professional. And I think that it kind of goes back to what Marcy alluded to with, you know, we look at those microaggressions and we have a couple of different options about how we're going to react to them, both in our personal life and then also in a classroom setting and in a professional life. You know, there's different ways to act. You can react, you can try to teach, you can make it a teachable moment, you can make it a conversational moment. And so, you know, I always go back on my own personal experiences and try to think like, okay, so how did I react? Was that a good outcome? Was it, even if it wasn't a great outcome, and that comes back to our tenants, even if it wasn't a great outcome, was that the appropriate response? And was that what actually should have happened? And, you know, I even had it in my classroom. I had a student who was kind of upset with me in our ESL class. And we were in, at that time, I was teaching the upper division or the upper level ESL class. And she said that, you know, I was trying to make their English sound so perfect that I was pulling all of the culture and color out of their language. And, you know, it was unfortunate that we had that conversation, that she wasn't satisfied with the response, and that unfortunately she did end up leaving class. But what it also did is it opened up a conversation for the rest of the students in the class that were there when the conversation occurred. And, you know, we had a really good dialogue as a class of, you know, 15 to 20 about what is appropriate. Do they need to make their language sound so much like us versus them? Or is it something where we're focusing on is their intention, or is what they're trying to say, the meaning of the words, is that really all they need to focus on? And so, you know, we took that, and I don't know if you would call it a microaggression event, but we took that event and really turned it into a dialogue, and that became, you know, a teachable moment. But even more so, it became a conversational moment. It became a moment of community building within our classroom. It became a moment of kind of a group understanding of what the intention was with the language, and with, you know, we want to honor the language. We want to honor your language. We want to honor both sides and your efforts, etc. And, you know, are we appreciating our cultures when we're doing what we're doing? And, you know, I've had a couple of different events like that. And I think it's just turning every single one of those events as best as you can into not just a teachable moment, but a conversational moment. I'll tell you another story quickly. I had a student from Yemen who came into our class as a new student and shared with us, as they all do when they come in as a new student, shared her name. And her name was Rana. And I had a bunch of students in my class, all who spoke Spanish. Rana means frog in Spanish. And so there was a little twittering off to the side, call that a microaggression, or just, you know, if I had a student who if somebody came into my book club or my gym and said my name was Frog, I would Twitter a little, you know. So, but she said that in Arabic, it meant deer. And this led to another great conversation with my students. They all then like, oh, shared their names, shared the origin, shared where they got it from, what it meant in their language. And the next thing I know, we have like a list on the board of everybody's names and where they were from and what they meant. And so I think it's, again, about intentionally taking those events and turning them into moments of learning and moments of appreciation.
Thank you so much, Karen. And Sue in the chat also thanked you for sharing that story. I'm going to turn to you, Marcy, because I know you have a similar story about kind of dealing with the student expectation regarding linguistics and where that led, if you'd like to, don't mind sharing.
Sure, I'm happy to share it. I have two points. So a lot of times I get students that say, I want to sound just like you. And sometimes they want my class because I am like this first language English. They want to sound just like me. And I teach advanced DSL. And so I try to encourage my students to embrace who they are and embrace how they sound. And I've responded many times with, I can understand you completely, and your accent represents you. I understand everything you're saying, and this is the beautiful part of you. So keep it, because it's who you are and who you came from. I wasn't always comfortable telling students that they didn't need perfect English. And so it was really recognizing, like, we don't want to be, you know, the tossed salad or the soup melting pot kind of idea. We don't want everyone to just sound the same. To sound like me, how boring would life be? And I tell my students that, like, you don't need to sound perfect or to sound just like me. You keep who you are and be understood. You want to have the language where you're understood, but keeping who you are and the importance of identity. who we are and our stories, our history and past. The other point I want to make is that accent does not always equal English fluency. So when a student comes into the office or comes into the school with a strong accent, it's important that we've got to stop making assumptions that this student needs or wants an ESL class. These students, maybe they're coming in for a CTE class, and it's really, really tricky, because with the IET program, we know if we hear a student that sounds like they might need some ESL, we want to align it or they sign up for CTE, but they sound like they might need some ESL, and we want to align that, because then we're going into the 243 funding and like, oh, this is like the coolest program. I love IET, but we cannot make assumptions. You're signing up for computer, sounds like you might need some ESL. We have to stop doing that. So we need to be really careful and aware of that.
Thank you so much, Marcy. I think it's that intentionality, right? And just giving students all of the options available to them and letting them choose and letting them inform us of what they specifically need, but avoiding that microaggression of assuming someone doesn't speak English well just because they have an accent. I have fantastic colleagues that I work with through this project, through other stuff that I work with American Institutes of Research, that are some of them are PhDs that have accents, and they're brilliant and they're completely understandable. And part of their identity and part of knowing who I'm talking to sometimes is like, I recognize that voice, you know what I mean? So I appreciate that you shared that and that you mentioned that to your students as well. Elizabeth also says, thank you for the story about accents. That's a wonderful way to respond. I want to turn now to Francisco, because you also mentioned earlier talking about student identity language. And so I want to connect that back to what we were talking about earlier. So Francisco, would you like to weigh in on the linguistic differences and how those are valued and appreciated?
Thanks, Sudie. Since everyone's sharing stories, I'm going to share one real quick before we get into it. I visited a school, one of our schools recently, and walking from the office to my car was like traveling across the world, right? Right when I opened the door to get out of the building, immediately I heard Spanish. A few steps later, I heard Farsi. And then I heard Chinese, and then I heard other different languages. By the time I got in my car, I thought, this is amazing. Only in this world that we work in are we able to experience and celebrate such diversity in languages and accents. And so I think when we could start valuing linguistics differences by moving away from a deficit lens and getting into a student identity lens, I think that's when we can start valuing and appreciating, because language is really a part of a student's identity. And earlier I talked about the complexity of identities and the intersectionality, and part of it is language. And when we can see the similarities and differences in language, such as tone, accents, and just certain ways of saying things, then linguistic differences can begin to be valued. And this is important to me because of my own experience, my identity related to language. I grew up in an area that was predominantly Spanish speaking, and I don't speak Spanish, but I valued and appreciated the Spanish language because of all my friends. I ignored Tagalog. I now understand that Tagalog, that language is part of my identity. It gives me insight of my culture and my relationships, my generational relationships with my parents, my older brother versus my younger sister. And so the language is a window into someone's identity and culture.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Francisco. And I also want to mention some of the great comments in the chat. So Ed said their ESL department chair tells their students that accents are a sign of courage. I love that. Yeah. Lori said, what is perfect English? I love that with question mark, exclamation point, because it is kind of a myth, right? We all have accents all across this country, Rochester, New York, Minnesota, Mississippi, California. Even within California, depending on what part of California you spend the most amount of time in, you might find some people that spent a lot of time in the Bay talk really fast and some do not, those kinds of things. So, you know, these dialects and how we speak and our linguistic differences also vary depending on where we learned English, right? And so that idea of perfect English and what that looks like, that's kind of relative, right? So yeah, I love that you mentioned that, Lori, and Karen seems to agree with you in the chat. All right, so before we open up to open question time, I do want to have one more question for all three of our wonderful panelists today. How do we keep moving forward, and how do we keep more momentum? We know that everybody is fatigued right now, and we know that, and we were talking about that just before this session started today. You know, people are fatigued in general. The pandemic has been a joint shared trauma that we've all experienced and our students are experiencing, we're all still experiencing. And there's so many different initiatives and so many things going on, but we can't afford to go back to not paying attention to equity, right? We can't afford to do that to our students. Our students need us to keep this at the forefront. Challenging, and I'm positive you're going to have great answers ready. But Marcy, Francisco, and Karen, I'm going to start with you, Marcy. What do we do to keep moving forward and keep that momentum?
Okay, so my opinion, I think we need to keep holding each other accountable, keep the conversation going, and understand and respect that it's okay to be uncomfortable and to have questions. There's been times where I've simmered with this question, like, I just really have a question. Is it okay? And then when I go with good intentions and ask someone like, hey, how would you like me to pronounce your name? Not a student, but maybe a colleague. I'm better with students, but it's okay. It's okay to just have questions and to speak up. Every time I have facilitated an equity training, and I've done it several times, the number one thing teachers and staff are worried about is I don't want to say the wrong thing and I don't want to offend someone. So when working with equity in your practice, you have to just be brave, be bold, and be the spokesperson for those that might not speak up.
I love that. Advocate for the people who cannot. Thank you so much, Marcy. Francisco, I'm going to turn to you. Same question. From your perspective, how do we keep moving forward and how do we keep the momentum on equity?
Just to be flexible, right? We all talked about student identity, and a student identity is, as I said, complex, and it also changes based on experiences and what one and time, right? And as the students move forward, as we move forward, their identities are impacted by, you know, whatever is happening, i.e. COVID, right? i.e. online learning. And so when we can begin to understand the complexities of student identity and being flexible to incorporate student identity in our instruction, in the way we provide services, I think flexibility is a key to moving forward with this and keeping the momentum with equity.
Yes, that flexibility as things are changing. And I just want to add on that when you start digging into the data, if you start pulling back the wallpaper, that means you're going to have to make some changes. That means you're going to have to be flexible and you're going to have to become a positive change agent, right? And so I think keeping that universal design for learning, that student first, student focused perspective, and that ability to be flexible and that willingness to change if we see that the data requires it is so important. Thank you, Francisco. And Karen, last but not least, how do you think we should keep moving forward and keep the momentum?
So I had, just as notes to myself, I just kind of made a fast list. So mine was make sure that there's close listening, that there's great conversations, that there's more listening, that you're looking at the data, that there, you know, both the numbers and the narratives, and still that there's more listening. I think the listening is really important and the acting upon those conversations is needed. And I really love the idea of listening without wanting to add to the conversation, but listening to think about what's being said and really get to the heart of what's being said. And it really goes back to me all to the 4 tenets. You know, are you engaged if you're just waiting for your turn to talk? Or are you engaged if someone else's truth makes you so uncomfortable that you're trying to change the conversation or stop the conversation with like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened to you, versus you know, how can I help? I'm listening. Are you really engaged in the conversation if you just want to fix the problem, or that you can't accept that there isn't going to be consensus or closure with that problem. I think that we really need to be humble listeners instead of reactive responders. And I think that, tied to, of course, our data and what our students are telling us and what we're seeing in the numbers that we also reflect that, I think that's how we're going to move forward.
Thank you so much, Karen. Listen, listen, and listen some more is what I took from that. And I think that's really important. And I think to piggyback on that, when we're listening, that we're not just listening to our colleagues, we're not just listening to people on the webinars and the training facilitators and the subject matter experts, but that we're listening to our students. And sometimes that means surveying them, finding out how they're feeling. If you really want to know if your campus displays embracing diversity, being inclusive, and being equitable, the first people you want to ask are your students, right? Because they can really tell you. So, listen with your hearts and your minds. And I love that, listen to do something and to listen to actually hear and understand and perceive and take in what's happening so that you can process it and develop a plan to move forward, and not just listen to respond and react immediately, because then we don't take time to sit with what's really needed. And then I want to add, before we get into our additional questions phase, to make sure that as you're going through this process, as you're listening, right, sometimes if something does make us feel uncomfortable, we do need to stop and ask ourselves, why is this making me uncomfortable? But we also need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. And so as we create these brave spaces and we hold these brave truths and we speak our truths, it's also important to take care of yourself. And so that means, and I said this last time, and I want to remind everybody this time, that if you're in a dialogue that makes you uncomfortable because maybe you're on the receiving end of a microaggression, or maybe you're hearing it and you just don't know how to respond and you don't feel empowered in that moment, it's okay to take a beat, to process and take care of yourself, but it's not okay to just leave it there, because we have to serve our students and we have to make sure that whatever problematic behavior emerges, whether it's from a colleague or a student, that we're addressing that and not just letting it persist, because we as an agency can never be culturally proficient if our staff is not all culturally competent and proficient as well, right? So let's move into additional questions. I do want to get to Lori's comment because, wow, I totally believe you, and I'm not surprised by that, but how rude. One of her ESL teaching colleagues was once asked, how could she teach ESL because she had a Southern accent? It doesn't surprise me because, doing this work, you hear all kinds of stories, but it's not nice, but just another thing. You can have a Southern accent and teach English. It really is a thing. So does anybody have any questions for our panelists? They've shared so much of themselves and what they've been doing and their lived experiences with us. Do we have any questions or comments or anything? You can feel free to unmute and share. And after we get through Q&A, I also would like to invite Lori to share some really cool news from CASAS in this equity and social justice space. So any questions? Are we all feeling okay? Feeling like we're ready to be brave and kind of engage in these conversations, or sit with the information and think about how we can move forward? Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Sudi. I just want to thank our panel. I think this is one of the ways that helps me as a principal to move forward, is doing it together and hearing from other schools, campuses, especially from teachers. It just invigorates me and keeps my motivation and inspiration going. So thank you. I was looking forward to this, and I'm glad I attended. Thank you.
I'm glad you did too. Thank you so much, Ed. And Ed is also a change agent in his own right. While he's very humble, but he is. And yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that CalPro and California Department of Education, and Carolyn Zachary was on earlier being a fly on the wall, that she was here until the end of our webinar, but that we have been given the space to do this work and to move these conversations forward. And part of that is hearing from people who are actively in the field doing these things on a daily basis. While I'm no longer teaching, working in professional development, I'm not the boots on the ground doing that work right now. And so it's really important to hear your voices. So thank you, Marcy, Karen, and Francisco for being here today. Barbara says, great session, lots to think about and how it relates to our students. Thank you, Barbara. Lori, I do want to invite you, if you don't mind, to share with us some really cool co-op information out of CASAS.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Sudie, for inviting me, and thank you, everyone. It's so great to hear what everyone had to say today and all the comments. I appreciate being a part of this, and it was actually in the first session of this three-set series that Sudie and Veronica and I started talking and realizing that we could collaborate on what we're calling right now the social justice resource sheet or tip sheet. CASAS has developed an civics assessment or COAP 53.2, which deals with social justice. And we realized that in offering that COAP, we were wanting to make sure that teachers had the support they needed to teach, to do instruction in social justice and assess that as well. We also realized that it would be helpful for our culture co-op 11 and all the ones in civic objective 11, that it would be helpful to have some resources. So Sudie and Veronica volunteered to assist me in developing together a resource sheet. So CalPro and CASAS are collaborating on this research sheet. We hope will be completed soon. That includes suggestions or resources for agencies, for teachers, for students, for instruction, and also for self-care, as Sudie mentioned how important that is. So we're thinking we have quite a list of resources that will be helpful, and we'll be introducing it at the civics network meetings, as well as other venues. So perhaps we'll be able to do a presentation on it at Casa Summer Institute or other venues so that people can become familiar and have some resources to help them in instruction and assessment in social justice and culture.
Thank you so much, Lori. I'm really excited about it. It's been fun getting to collaborate with Lori and Veronica on this, and we have really great conversations around these topics. And I think it's important as state leadership projects that we have shared understanding of the importance of these things. And so I'm excited about this coming out. Some of the resources are really great, including lessons around diversity, equity, and inclusion that you can integrate into your classroom. If you're looking for resources to be more inclusive, there's going to be a lot of stuff that can help you with that. And like Lori mentioned, self-care, taking care of yourself, professional development, those kinds of things. So honored that Lori asked Veronica and I to work on it, and really excited for it to come out, and just really enjoy working with you, Lori. So with that, we will wrap up. Thank you all so much for coming to our Brave Space today and for being here. If you have any questions that maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking in the chat or publicly, please feel free to email me afterwards. And if it's for one of our panelists, I'll be sure to pass that information along. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for being agents of change. Have a beautiful rest of the week. Thank you again, Marcy, Karen, and Francisco. Appreciate you so much. And Vicki, thanks for being the wizard behind